The land office clerk told her the property was in good standing, which she understood to mean the taxes were paid. It did not mean what she had hoped it meant. She arrived in late October, when the aspens had already gone and the sky over the foothills sat low and gray as a wool blanket someone had left out in the rain. The stage let her off at the edge of Pincher Creek, and the driver said good luck in a way that did not sound like he meant it. She had a trunk, a leather satchel, and a letter from a solicitor in Calgary stating that the property known as the Thornley Quarter section had passed to her upon the death of her brother, one Hugh Lachlan McRae, aged 31, of causes the letter described as prolonged and the doctor had described, when she'd asked him directly, as grief wearing the body down until the body agreed. She had not seen Hugh in 4 years. She had not known he'd bought land. She had not known much about what Hugh had been doing at all, except that he'd gone west and sent money when he could, and written letters that said things were fine in a way that meant they weren't. She stood on the road outside the stage office with her trunk and her satchel and the letter, and she looked out past the buildings toward the hills, and she thought, well, that was all. Just that. Well, the man at the livery stable told her the Thornley Quarter was 12 miles south, and that there was a man out there who had been working it since spring. He said this carefully, the way people say things when they are watching to see what your face does. Her face did nothing. She hired a wagon. The approach was a lane of frozen mud and old wheel ruts, running between 2 rows of trembling aspen that had mostly dropped their leaves. The house sat at the end of it, a 2-story frame building with a covered porch, one window boarded over on the upper left, smoke coming from the chimney. Behind it, a barn in better shape than she expected, a woodpile that was serious, a kitchen garden cut back for winter, but the beds were edged properly, straw-mulched, tucked in like something someone intended to return to. She noticed the woodpile first, then the garden beds, then the smoke. Someone was home, and they had not let things go. She pulled the wagon up to the gate and sat for a moment. The cold came in under her coat collar, and she let it because she wanted to be thinking clearly when she knocked, and cold helped with that. The door opened before she reached the porch steps. He was taller than she expected, though she wasn't sure what she'd expected. Dark-haired, wind-burned, somewhere in his middle 30s, wearing a canvas work coat with a tear in the left elbow that had been mended and torn again. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that changes the shape of the day he thought he was going to have. She said, "I'm Hugh McRae's sister." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You'd better come in." His name was Crosby. That was what he said when she asked. Just Crosby, no first name offered, and she didn't press. The kitchen was clean. That was the second thing she noticed about him, after the woodpile. A man alone in a house for months, and the kitchen was clean. There was coffee on the stove. He poured 2 cups without asking if she wanted one, which she found she didn't mind. She sat at the table and put the solicitor's letter down between them, and he looked at it without touching it. "I know what it says," he told her. "Then you know why I'm here." "I know what it says about the property." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "Whether that explains why you're here is a different question." She looked at him. He looked at the letter. "Hugh and I had an arrangement," he said. "He needed someone to run the place. I needed land to work. We split what the cattle brought. He kept the deed." A pause. "I didn't know he was sick." She thought about Hugh's letters. "Fine, things are fine." "No," she said. "Not many people did." Outside, the wind picked up and something on the barn creaked and settled. He got up and looked out the window. Not anxious, she thought, just checking. A man who listened to his property the way some people listen to weather. "How many head?" she asked. He turned. 22. "I sold 6 in September, which was the right call. Grass was short and the winter signs were early." He said it without defensiveness. "You've already made peace with. The money's in the account in town. I have the ledger." She had not about the money. She had not asked. She made a note of the fact that he'd brought them up anyway. "I'll want to see it," she said. "I thought you might." He got up and went to a shelf near the door and came back with a cloth-covered notebook. He set it on the table and slid it across to her. She opened it. The entries went back to April. Date, activity, expenditure, income. His handwriting was small and even. The columns lined up. She turned pages slowly, not because she needed to study each one, but because the act of turning them was telling her things. The regularity of it, the lack of crossed-out entries, the way the figures at the bottom of each month were totaled twice, once in pencil and once confirmed in ink. This was a man who checked his own work. She closed the ledger. The boarded window, she said. Upstairs, hinge pin on the shutter rusted through. Shutter blew into the glass in August. I was going to replace the pane before winter, but the glazier in town was backed up 6 weeks and then the cold came early. He paused. I can show you the repair list. There's a list. She almost smiled. She didn't, but it was close, she said. Tomorrow. It's getting dark. He looked out the window again. There's a second bedroom, he said. Hugh's things are still in it. I can move them if... Leave them, she said. I'll sort them myself. He nodded and said nothing more about it, which was the correct thing. That first night, she lay in her brother's bed and looked at the ceiling and tried to find the shape of what she'd walked into. The sheets smelled of cedar. Someone had put cedar in the drawer of the dresser to keep the moths out. She didn't think her brother had done that. Hugh had never thought about moths in his life. She thought about the ledger. She thought about the woodpile, which was high enough to last through February without cutting more if they were careful. She thought about the kitchen garden beds, straw-mulched and edged, waiting for spring with a patience that gardens have when they've been treated properly. She thought, Hugh, what were you doing out here? Not angry, just, Hugh. She had spent 4 years not asking that question, because the asking would have meant going, and she'd had her own reasons for staying where she was, her own losses she was still walking around the edges of. A husband buried in the rocky soil of the Capel Valley. A child who had not survived its first winter. 2 years of telling herself she would manage, and then 2 more years of discovering that managing and living were not the same thing. She had come here because the solicitor's letter said she had to decide within 60 days whether to maintain the property or sell. She had come to look at it. She had not come to stay. She lay in Hugh's bed and listened to the wind work the corners of the house, and the house hold. In the morning she was up before him, which surprised her and then didn't, because she had slept in a strange bed and her mind had been running when her body wasn't. She found the stove's rhythms on her own, the damper, the draft, the particular sulkiness it had when the wood wasn't fully seasoned, which some of it wasn't. She made coffee and was standing at the kitchen window when he came downstairs. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at her standing at his stove with his coffee, and he thought something she couldn't read. And then he sat down at the table and said, "Thank you," which was not what she'd expected. They ate without much talking. She looked out the window at the barn. "What's the morning order?" she asked. A pause. "Feed first, then water if the trough's iced over, which it will. Check the calves. I've got 2 heifers bred for November, so I'm watching them." He stopped. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," she said. "What's the morning order?" He told her. She had not worked cattle since she was a girl on her father's farm in Manitoba, and that had been dairy, not beef, and she found that the body remembered some things and not others. She remembered the smell. She remembered the way a spooked animal moves differently from a sick one. She did not remember cold so particular as this cold October in the foothills with the mountains sitting right there, close enough to seem like they were listening. He did not explain things she didn't ask about. She found she appreciated that more than she expected. Is a kind of man who treats unfamiliarity like helplessness and cannot stop demonstrating that he has noticed the difference between you and him. Crosby was not that kind of man. He worked beside her and answered questions when she had them and otherwise said nothing. She had a question about the fence line along the east pasture. 3 posts that looked newer than the others, she asked. Replace them in July, he said. The old ones were punky, would have gone in the first freeze. She nodded. He'd replaced them before they failed, not after. She filed that away. By 11 o'clock, she had a picture of the place that was different from the one she'd arrived with. It was not a ruined property. It was a property that had come close and been held back by someone who knew what he was doing and had kept doing it alone, without anyone knowing whether he'd be asked to leave in the spring. That was the part that stayed with her. He had kept the garden beds edged and mulched for a season that might not be his. The list of repairs was 7 items. 2 were urgent, 2 were before spring. 3 were eventually. She read it at the kitchen table that evening, while he sat across from her with the ledger open, cross-referencing something he'd noticed in September's figures. She did not ask what he'd noticed. She waited. After a while, he said, "I over-ordered on salt blocks in August. Bought for 28 head, not 22. I should have adjusted when I sold the 6. He said it the way a person admits a small mistake to themselves, not performing it for her, just noting it in the record. She looked up from the repair list. "What did you do with the extra?" "Still in the barn. They'll keep." She looked back at the list. "The window," she said. "I can put the pane in myself if you can get the glass from town." He looked up. "I know how to do it," she said. "My father's farm. You learn." "All right," he said. "Just that. All right." She wrote a figure next to the window on the list. He did not comment on it, had probably noticed the number, and agreed with it. She added that to the picture she was building of him. Not a man who argued for argument's sake. A man who saved his disagreement for things that actually mattered. There was a lamp between them on the table, and outside the wind was starting up again, and the house held the warmth the stove threw in a way she had come to understand as competent insulation. Sue. Not luck. Hugh's house. Her house. Now, the house of a man who had caulked the windows before winter came in, not for the first time, judging by the layering of old caulk beneath the new. She was $58 to the good in the ledger, once you subtracted repairs and supplies. Not prosperous, but not breaking. She stayed through the first snowfall, which came in the second week of November, and was serious enough that staying was simply the correct decision. She stayed through the calving, which was harder than she expected. One of the heifers needed help, and they worked in the barn for 4 hours in the cold, and the calf lived, and afterward they stood in the barn doorway, and she felt something release in her chest that she had not known was tight. "Good," Crosby said, looking at the calf. "Yes," she said. That was all. She wrote to the solicitor in Calgary and told him she would not be selling. She did not mention Crosby in the letter. That was a separate question from the property question, and she was in the habit of solving one question at a time. December was work, not struggle. She was careful about that word in her mind. But the daily accumulation of tasks that winter on a foothills property required of you, and that required you not to miss any of them, or the debt you owed the season grew. She learned the cattle by name because he had named them, and because names made animals easier to think about as individuals, which they were. She learned the stove's temperament in deep cold, which was different from its temperament in the shoulder seasons. She learned where the lane got treacherous after thaw-freeze cycles, and where it stayed safe. She learned him too, the way you learn someone you live alongside without meaning to, by proximity and repetition. He was up before her most mornings, but not always. He did not talk before the second cup of coffee, which she respected. He was good with the cattle in a way that was quiet and unshowy, and the cattle knew it. He had books, fewer than she expected, more than most men she had known in similar circumstances. And he read in the evenings when the work was done, and once she borrowed one without asking, and he said nothing about it, and when she finished it, she put it back in the same place. And the next evening there was another one on the table near where she usually sat, placed there by no one she could prove. She read it. In January, he had 3 days where he barely spoke even for the second cup of coffee, and his jaw was set differently, tight at the hinge, and he didn't look toward the mountains, which he usually did, out some habit she hadn't asked about. She didn't ask about these 3 days either. She had lived through enough of her own to recognize the weather of them in another person. She just kept the coffee ready and did not ask him to be otherwise than he was. On the 4th day, he was himself again, or near enough. He said at breakfast, "My wife died 2 years ago." She looked at him. "I'm not telling you so you'll say something," he said. "I just thought—" He stopped, looked at his cup. "The house gets heavier in January. I thought you'd noticed." "I'd noticed," she said. He nodded. She poured him more coffee. Outside, the snow was starting again, fine and light, the kind that didn't amount to much. February was the hardest because February always was. The cold had been going long enough that it stopped feeling like a season and started feeling like the world's actual state. And you had to argue yourself back from that belief every morning. The cattle wanted more, the days gave less, And there was a week in the middle of the month when the temperature dropped so far that they lost 2 calves, despite everything. And he blamed himself the way she had learned. He blamed himself, which was silently and thoroughly and without burdening her with it. She told him, the cow on the north end was going to lose that calf regardless. I've seen it before. He said nothing. I'm telling you because it's true, she said. Not to make you feel better. He looked at her for a moment with something she couldn't name exactly. Then he said, all right. She thought that might be the most important conversation they'd had, but she couldn't have explained why. March came the way it always came, with a false early softness, and then another week of cold, and then finally, something that meant it. The creek at the south edge of the property ran again. The cattle moved differently in the pasture, heads up, some old readiness coming back into their bodies. She found herself walking the fence line in the afternoons for no reason, except that it was possible to do it comfortably again, and the foothills in early March were a thing she had not expected. The snow still in the shadows, the south-facing slopes already showing brown grass, the mountains still white and close, and the sky beginning to shift from gray toward that particular color she could only call here. She found him fixing the east fence gate one afternoon, the one she'd asked about in October, the hinge that didn't seat right. I meant to do that in November, he said. You were busy in November, she said. He looked at her. She looked at the gate. I'd like to plant a larger kitchen garden this year, she said. If I'm going to be here for spring, she paused. I'm going to be here for spring. It wasn't a question. She'd meant it to be a question, and somewhere between thinking it and saying it, it had become a statement which was more honest. He went back to the hinge. He worked at it for a moment, the creak of it, the resistance. Then it seated finally, and the gate swung clean. I'll break up the south bed in April, he said. For the expansion. She nodded. She walked back to the house. Inside, the stove was warm, and the coffee was from this morning, but close enough. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the property. The barn, the woodpile down now to what she'd calculated they'd need to see out the rest of the cold, the garden beds beginning to show at their edges where the snow had pulled back. She had come here in October to decide whether to sell. She had been so certain, in the stage on the way out, that she would know immediately, that the land would tell her something simple, and she would either feel it or not and act accordingly. That was not how it had worked. The land had told her something, just not simply. It had said, look closer. Look at who has been here. Look at what they've kept. She had looked. She was outside. She could hear him coming back across the yard, his boots on the frozen ground. The same sound she had learned across 5 months of mornings. The gate swung shut behind him with a click that it hadn't had before. Something that had been tipped slightly all winter settled back to level. She turned from the window and went to pour the coffee before he got to the door.